1942, coastal Louisiana. A Caterpillar D8 eases off a prepared approach and into marsh that looks solid enough to carry it. Then black water rises through the tracks. The tractor is still under power when the ground stops being ground. What happened next would keep taking steel. To understand why 54 Caterpillar D8s disappeared into a Louisiana marsh in 1942, you have to go back to the pressure of that year. The United States was no longer preparing for war. It was already in it. After Pearl Harbor, shipyards, foundries, railroads, and engine plants were being forced into a tempo they had never sustained before. On the Gulf Coast, one of the most urgent demands was landing craft. Andrew Jackson Higgins and his New Orleans works had become essential to American amphibious war production. The small, blunt-bowed boats his yards were turning out would soon carry troops onto beaches across the world. But before they could leave in numbers large enough to matter, the yards needed access. Materials had to move in, finished hulls had to move out. And in coastal Louisiana, access was never just a matter of distance, it was a matter of ground. The proposed canal route crossed marsh country that looked solid from a distance and betrayed machines up close. This was delta land built from waterborne sediment, decaying vegetation, trapped gas, and a thin crust that could hold a man where it could not hold a tractor. In dry weather, it seemed stable enough to survey. Under load, it changed character. Weight that should have been spread by tracks was transferred into saturated organic soil with almost no shear strength. On paper, a Caterpillar D8 was exactly the kind of machine you sent to a rushed wartime excavation. It was powerful, proven, and already respected on major American jobs. Depending on configuration, a D8 of that period weighed in the neighborhood of 28,000 to more than 30,000 pounds before the ground under it was asked to absorb the added force of blade work. That mattered because the marsh was not resisting only static weight. It was being shocked, churned, and remolded with every pass. The canal was meant to solve a wartime bottleneck. It would connect production more directly to navigable water and reduce delays in moving landing craft and heavy materials through the maze of bayous, shallow approaches, and congested local routes that slowed everything around New Orleans. In 1942, delay had its own cost. Every week mattered. The Army, the Navy, federal agencies, contractors, and private industry were all learning the same lesson at once. If a project touched war production, it would be pushed harder than normal engineering judgment preferred. The machine entered the crisis long before the crisis became visible. Crews assembled with the confidence that comes from horsepower and urgency. Caterpillar D8s were among the heaviest crawler tractors available, in large enough numbers to be useful on a project like this. They had the torque for pushing spoil, cutting shallow grades, dragging equipment, and opening access where wheeled machines would fail immediately. In firmer country, the wide tracks of a crawler spread weight well enough to make the machine look almost amphibious compared with trucks. But marsh ground is deceptive in a way hardpan, clay, and even desert sand are not. A crawler can survive weak surface conditions if there is competent material beneath. Louisiana Marsh often offered no such layer within reach of the machine's bearing pressure. What looked like ground was sometimes only a floating mat of roots and vegetation over waterlogged mud. That distinction decided everything. Once the first machines moved off prepared approaches and into the cut zone, the surface began to fail in stages. Not dramatic at first. A little settlement under one track, water rising where the blade pressed down, fine lateral movement in the mat beneath the tractor. Operators knew those signs. Most had seen soft ground before. But marsh failure is not always immediate, and that can make it worse. A machine may advance several lengths while the substrate is slowly losing structure beneath it. The operator feels drag, adds throttle, and the tracks do what tracks always do when traction disappears. They dig. Material that seemed dense enough to support weight becomes slurry under repeated loading. The machine is no longer climbing out. It is milling its own foundation away. Mechanically, the problem was this. The D8's power was enough to keep the tracks turning after the marsh had stopped acting like soil. That power, which made the tractor valuable, also accelerated the failure once the organic layer broke down. The track grousers could not bite into a stable base because there often was none. Instead, they cut through root mat, stirred black water and peat, and pumped the machine deeper with each attempt to self-recover. On firmer projects, one stuck tractor could often be pulled by another. In the Louisiana Marsh, the rescuer entered the same physics as the machine it was trying to save, and that is how a fleet problem begins. Not with one catastrophic moment, but with a chain reaction. One D8 settles. Another is sent to pull it free. That second machine finds only a few more feet of apparently usable surface before its own weight starts to break the crust. Timber matting is tried in sections, spoil is pushed ahead to form a working platform, and men on the job start reading the marsh by color, vibration, and the way water moves around the tracks. But wartime tempo leaves little room for patience. The canal still has to be cut. The production schedule still stands. So the operation presses forward, and the marsh keeps taking steel. Some accounts from Gulf Coast work in this period describe machines disappearing not in a single plunge, but in a slow burial that was more unnerving. First, the lower rollers vanish. Then the belly pan approaches the surface. Then water and mud rise around the sprockets. Once the tractor loses clearance under the frame, suction and drag multiply. Recovery becomes less about horsepower than about flotation and load distribution. The problem was no longer excavation. It was whether the site could carry the machines needed to continue it. By then, the canal job had become something else entirely. It was still a construction project on paper. On the ground, it was a contest between wartime urgency and delta physics, and the marsh was winning. 54 Caterpillar D8s would eventually be lost into that ground. But before the count reached that number, crews had to learn the hard way what the marsh was doing under them, why conventional crawler logic was failing, and why each new attempt to force progress could make the site weaker instead of stronger. In Louisiana in 1942, steel, time, and war production had met a surface that only looked like land. Then the margin disappeared. By the time the count reached dozens, the operation had already crossed the line between aggressive construction and controlled loss. The canal alignment was still there on survey paper. The schedule still mattered. Higgins production still demanded a route through the marsh. But on the ground, each additional machine sent forward was entering a site that had already proved it could not carry the load being asked of it. The D8s were not failing because they were weak machines. They were failing because the surface beneath them was no longer behaving like ground in any conventional construction sense. Recovery methods changed as the losses mounted. Crews tried timber mats, spoil fills, chained pulls, staggered tractor positioning, and work from the edges of whatever firmer approach remained. On paper, those are reasonable responses. On a road job, a dam embankment, or a river crossing with a competent base below the mud, they might have worked. In the Louisiana Marsh, the problem was deeper. The root mat and soft organic layers could deform over a wide area, spreading failure far beyond the point where one machine had first broken through. That meant the site did not simply contain isolated stuck tractors. It contained expanding zones of compromised support. One buried machine created another weak point. One failed pull widened the field of unstable ground around it. Mechanically, the D8s were doing exactly what they were built to do. Engines delivered torque, tracks kept turning, blades pushed spoil forward in an effort to create working platforms. But that same force remolded the marsh under load. The more the tractors fought, the more the substrate lost structure. Water displaced upward. Organic material sheared apart. The thin strength of the surface mat was broken faster than crews could replace it. A crawler tractor can survive soft ground if motion is maintained over a surface that still spreads load. Once that surface collapses and the machine settles into semi-fluid material, the rules change. Now the tracks are not traveling across the marsh, they are excavating into it. At that point, the operation changed. The problem was no longer how to keep the canal moving on schedule. The problem was whether any additional machines sent into the cut could be expected to come back out. 54 Caterpillar D8s is not a single accident. It is a cumulative verdict delivered by terrain. Each machine represented steel, labor, transport, fuel, wartime value, and operator risk, and each one that settled into the marsh made the next decision harder. Stop, and the project stalls under wartime pressure. Continue, and the marsh keeps collecting machines. That is why this episode matters. The loss was not just numerical. It exposed a limit that heavy equipment operators have understood ever since. Horsepower is not the same thing as access. A crawler's reputation for mobility can create false confidence in places where flotation is the real currency. In Delta Marsh, especially under rushed conditions, ground pressure figures and machine mass are only part of the story. The deeper question is whether the site has any competent layer available to carry repeated dynamic loading at all. If the answer is no, then the machine is fighting physics, not just mud. Eventually, the buried D8s were left where they had gone down. Some were too deep for practical recovery with the equipment and methods available under wartime urgency. Some were likely stripped of whatever could be salvaged before abandonment. Others simply became part of the marsh itself, disappearing under water, peat and silt as the site changed around them. That is often how industrial losses vanish from public memory, not with a headline large enough to preserve the details, but with a job that moves on, a war that absorbs attention, and machinery that slips below the surface where only local memory remains. The canal, in one form or another, still belonged to the larger war effort. Higgins kept building landing craft. American amphibious production accelerated. The machine losses did not stop the wider industrial momentum of the Gulf Coast, but they did leave behind one of the strangest heavy equipment episodes of the wartime home front. A fleet of major crawler tractors consumed not by enemy action, not by fire, not by collapse of steel or concrete, but by marsh ground that refused to become a road, a platform, or a working base. The site is quiet now. The wartime urgency is gone. The crews are gone. The shouted hand signals, the exhaust hanging over wet ground, the chain pulls, the rising black water around track frames. All of it passed into the larger blur of 1942, but the lesson remains sharp. The machines entered the crisis long before the crisis became visible. The first settlement under the tracks was the beginning. The first assumption that one more tractor could solve the problem was the trap. In the final count, 54 Caterpillar D8s, was not the story of a reckless machine. It was the story of a surface that looked buildable until weight, repetition, and time proved otherwise. What survived was the record of what the marsh could do to steel under pressure. If you appreciate machine history told at ground level, subscribe. This channel is built for stories exactly like this. Real machines, real sites, and the moment when a decision met terrain and left a consequence behind. And this was not the last time American ground swallowed crawler tractors whole. Years later, in other swamps, flood zones, and unstable cuts, crews would relearn the same lesson under different names. Now back to the archive.